audio by Raising Free People Network.
I'm Akila S. Richards, grief literacy educator, longtime podcaster, here to explore what we lose individually and collectively when we fail to name grief as part of our everyday life. Grief isn't just about death, it's about endings, expired relationships, outgrown roles, identities and dreams we released. If we tend to grief in its diversity, we can expand our capacity to navigate change, to hold space for each other, and to move with more presence in a rapidly shifting world. This is What I Let Die podcast, where we move from grief struck to grief tending. What happens when we stop avoiding grief? Let's find out together. Hey, you. Welcome back to What I Let Die. This is episode 3, and if you've been here for a couple of episodes or just present to your grief at any level, you already know that grief doesn't just live in one neat little category, right? It's not just about death. It's not just sadness. And it definitely is not something that follows a timeline or a set of stages that we can check off like a to-do list. So today, on this beautiful rainy morning, I wish I could record outside in the rain, but I'm going to bring the rain energy in here this morning. Today, I want to talk to you about something that comes up a lot in the different spaces that I'm in as a witness and sometimes as a participant when we start naming grief. And that is the connection between grief and mental health. And I want to get into this. I'm dedicating an entire episode to this because it feels, I don't know, maybe most people know this, but I feel like enough people don't for me to say this and remind you to say this out loud so we remember. And it is that grief is not a mental illness. Grief is not a mental illness, but it does impact mental health in ways that can be confusing, especially when we don't have language for what we're experiencing. And if you have not listened to episode 2, where I talk about why language matters so much in our ability to hold and move with grief, I recommend that you do. Now, I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a psychiatrist. That's not what this is. I'm here as someone who has spent years in the world of grief, bereavement, and end-of-life care, having real conversations with real people who are in it. And I've seen how grief interacts with mental health. I have been around grief and bereavement professionals who speak to this, people whose classes I've taken, people who I've sat with in their real grief navigation, real life, real time. So in all of this, I've gotten to see how grief interacts with mental health and how it gets misnamed, misunderstood, or dismissed completely. And I want to help you to recognize it in yourself, in your people, in the world around you. So today, I'm doing some mad question asking with you around the connection between grief and mental health. And those questions are, how does grief interact with mental health? So by the end of the episode, we definitely will have worked through that question. Also, how do we know when grief is showing up as something else? How do we know when it's trauma, anxiety, emotional exhaustion, numbness? That's the other question. And how do we make space for all of it without forcing it into categories that don't actually fit? Yeah? So these are our 3 questions. This is our invitation to slow down and sit with the weight of this topic, to savor it, because I know it's heavy. So let's take a breath together. We are in this together. First, let's start with the premise that grief is not just sadness, and mental health is not just depression. A lot of us think about grief and immediately associate it with sadness, right? But grief is not just sadness. Grief is a full body, whole ass, full mind experience that can show up in ways that might not even be recognized as grief. Grief can look like exhaustion, irritability, brain fog, physical pain. Grief can make us anxious, make us overthink, make us feel like we've lost control of our emotions. Grief can leave us feeling numb. It's a very common one. Dissociated, another common one, detached from reality. And because of all of that, grief often gets mistaken for a mental health crisis or completely ignored as just being in a funk. And that's a huge part of why I'm doing this series, because I recognize that we need to be careful because we don't have a lot of education around grief from school or from our places where we, quote unquote, get educated. And that causes us to be so unskilled, so unprepared, so out of touch with what grief looks like. So we got to be careful because we don't realize that grief can coexist with mental health conditions. And perhaps if you are in therapy or counseling, this is something you're moving through with a professional. But as we know, a lot of these spaces, even therapy, have been miseducated, have been impacted by mindsets and practices that do not actually support the human experience, but more so fund and support the systemic experience. So we need to be able to detangle these things. And this is what I am wanting to be part of, the movement of people and spaces that really want us to get clear on the humanized ways that we get to move through these experiences. So because grief is often mistaken for a mental health crisis or completely ignored as somebody just being in a funk, we don't understand that someone might be grieving and dealing with clinical depression. We don't understand that someone might be grieving and holding trauma in their body. Someone might be grieving and struggling with anxiety, panic attacks, dissociation. It's not one or the other, it's layered. I've worked with someone who was going through a divorce and obviously grieving elements of that divorce and also moving through anxiety. Now, the process and the realities of that divorce amplified the anxiety, but the grief and the anxiety called for different ways of being treated. Anxiety, in the case of this particular client, called for medication because it was impacting his life in ways that medication could support. The medication could help him chemically restore something that his body was not producing so that he could be in a healthier mental space to move through the actual grief. They were not the same and they needed different things. He and I could work on the grief tending skills together. He could work on grief tending skills by himself even, but the anxiety, he could not. He needed something else in the meantime while his body and brain were processing the severity and the layers of this divorce. So yes, he was sad. Yes, he was grieving and he was anxious. And some of those things we can work on through talking, through rituals, through practice. And one of those things needed, for a time, chemical support. Not always, not for everyone, but sometimes for some situations. The main thing here is that grief is not just sadness, and mental health is not just depression or anxiety. And the way that grief interacts with mental health is unique for each person. Now let's talk a little bit more about anxiety and trauma and other ways that grief can get tangled up with other mental and emotional experiences. Let's start with grief and trauma. Grief and trauma are not the same thing. Grief and trauma are not the same thing, but they can and do oftentimes overlap. Trauma is what happens when a loss feels overwhelming, shocking, unsafe. If a death or a loss of a job, a breakup, or another major shift felt sudden or violent or out of your control, it might not just be grief. It might also be trauma. So if you ever felt stuck in grief, unable to even touch it without panicking or shutting down, that might be trauma. Grief and anxiety work in a similar way. Grief doesn't just look like sadness, it can feel like fear. So hyper awareness of loss, right? You start worrying about losing other people and it's on your mind like 80% of the time. That's an example of how grief can move over into anxiety. Physical tension, panic, trouble sleeping, when your body holds on to grief in ways that you might not expect, and you are now processing and dealing with multiple days of waking up in a panic or trying to fall asleep and a sense of panic and not being able to sleep, having a lot of tension in the body that's impacting this feeling of panic. So your body holding on to grief that isn't something you can just like take a walk or do a simple practice to move through. It's keeping it. Or when you're feeling like something is off, even though everything is technically fine. So if you've had an anxiety spike, for example, after a loss, feeling like you have to control everything that you can to prevent more loss, first of all, you're not alone. That happens to so many of us. And second of all, maybe the grief has moved over into anxiety. And it may mean that you have to get support outside of yourself to move through that anxiety. Again, it doesn't necessarily mean medication, but it means being open to more than what you might be able to work through if it were just grief. So we've touched on grief and trauma. We've touched on grief and anxiety. Let's also touch on grief and burnout, emotional exhaustion, brain fog. These are all types of emotional exhaustion or clues maybe for emotional exhaustion, burnout, dissociation, constant brain fog, right? And it can be so layered, y'all, because some of these things, like when I look at brain fog and dissociation, these are also things that are showing up for me as I move through perimenopause. So how do I know when it's grief and how do I know when it's emotional exhaustion? Being in touch with grief, understanding how grief moves through me, grief literacy education. Again, I do this shit because I need this shit, not because I'm trying to preach on top of or over onto the people. These are my places of deep education that I want to share, that I want to be in conversation about. So again, if you are hearing this and these things feel like, oh my God, me too, and here's what I learned and here's what I'm confused about, I want to remind you that I blog over on radicalselfie.org, and after every episode, I do a short postmortem about that topic. And I'm doing that extra step because I want to engage in conversation. Every time I post about a topic that's covered here on an episode, I write this short postmortem and I link it to the chat room for What I Let Die podcast. So be sure to head over to radicalselfie.org. You can join as a free member or a paid member and get access to this space where we are continuing the conversation. So how do we distinguish? How do we know when it comes to the difference between grief and emotional exhaustion? Questioning has been helpful for me. So have you ever lost someone and felt like your brain just stopped working? You weren't just feeling sad, you were feeling disconnected and numb, and the feeling continued. Have you ever lost something, a presence in your life of something important to you or something that was so normal to you for a long time? And it wasn't a person, but it was something else. And you felt completely checked out, like your emotions were locked away. Maybe it's not maybe it's a present feeling for you. You feel completely checked out and like your emotions are locked away. This is grief protecting itself. It's a survival mechanism. And sometimes when our grief morphs into this protective ball that shuts everything else out, that's when we might benefit from working with a professional of some sort or a trusted spiritual guide of some sort, which is also a professional. But I mean, not just a counselor or a therapist, but it could be a spiritual companion. It could be a coach. It could be, if you're in a church, maybe the leader of that church or someone connected to that church. Grief protects itself to the point that it may morph into something else. So grief is not just an emotion. It's a physical, mental, social, and spiritual norm that we are born with. We are born with elements of grief. We are born knowing that ultimately we will die. We know this. We know that everyone and everything ultimately will die. We have experiences with grief through so many stages of our life. Losing a toy that we love as a little one, not getting what we want in a moment. We grieve, we wail, and as we get older, perhaps our grief becomes more sophisticated, complicated, but we've been dealing with grief the whole time. So grief has its own skill sets that we're not even aware of. It knows how to move and flow and protect itself. It's an entity we live with. And I'm saying we can do more than just live with it. We can actually become familiar with it. We can partner with it. We can have a level of intimacy with how our specific types of grief work us and how we work with them, so that when they morph into protective mechanisms, survival mechanisms, we have the experience to know that. We know the difference between our grief and our anxiety. We know how to find it out. This is what this series is going to support us in moving through, because grief protects itself. If nobody told you that before, now you know. Grief protects itself. It's not just emotional. It's spiritual, it's mental, it's social, it's physical, all of that. And when it overlaps with mental health experiences, it's important to name that complexity, not just force it into a binary of, is it grief or not? We need to understand these things so that we can care for ourselves. Because you and I know that self-care is not just about taking a bubble bath or saying no to something. These are types of self-care that might be wonderful and delicious and scrumptious. But caring for ourselves is also about becoming more wise, more educated about these lesser known, lesser understood aspects of the human experience, like grief tending. As we are moving through this type of education, how do we support ourselves and each other? What do we do with all of this? We stop trying to separate grief from mental health. Maybe that sounds like a surprise statement right now because I've spent some time talking about the difference. But yes, honey, one of the 4 things that I have written down right in front of me so that I remember to say this to you and that I remember to just like get into it with you here is that it is number 1, stop trying to separate grief from mental health. That's part of what we do with all of this. And I say that because you do not have to figure out if it's grief or anxiety or depression or exhaustion. You don't have to figure out which one it is. It's all happening inside you and it all deserves tending. And the reason I say you don't have to figure it out is because if you tend to the grief, if you do what you can for the parts that are grief because you are learning how to recognize grief, then the distinction will become more obvious to you. I've seen it happen so many times. I've personally experienced it so many times. If you tend to the grief, then the other things that linger, that really sit there beyond what you do to tend to the grief, all those other things are the things that you know you need some level of support for. So you don't have to figure it out. It's all happening inside of you, so it all deserves tending. And if you start by being more and more familiar, which I'm going to help you do, with how grief works for you specifically and the different types of grief that you in particular deal with, then you have the space to recognize what remains beyond the grief that you've tended to. And it's not that you tend to the grief in a one and done way. I mean, the moments where we can get grief off of the heavy chest press feeling over to something that's next to me and walking, and I don't want it here, but it's not a weight on my chest. That's what I mean by tending, to just put it in its place. You can't put anxiety and exhaustion and depression in their place. So no matter what you do, you won't be able to shake that feeling. But with grief, you will be able to lighten the sense of the weight of grief. And that's the difference. The second thing that I have here is that if you're unsure about what's happening, start with curiosity. Okay? So the first one was stop trying to separate grief from mental health. The second one is if you're unsure what's happening, start with curiosity. And by this, I mean, instead of trying to fix or label it immediately, start with questions like, what do I need right now? What would feel like relief for me right now? Can I get in touch with that? Who can hold space for me without judgment right now? This is how you start with curiosity. Check in with yourself. What do I need right now? What would feel like relief? What is something that I can do in this moment or try in this moment so that I can start to, in the eyelid course, in my grief course, we call it seeing the body, so that I can start to see the body and see myself as separate from this body of grief that I'm tending to. That's what we mean by that. Asking yourself that question is an invitation for your guidance counsel, spiritual and in person, to lean in and bring you something that you might need. So you might hear a subtle voice or feel a subtle nudge to do a simple thing like leave the house and go for a walk. Not get in the car, just right in your complex, in your subdivision, around your house, around your apartment. Just walk, right? Sometimes the body is like, just move me. Just move me. That's all I need. I just need for you to move me and I'll do the rest. Play a song. Move your body. You can even be sitting down and just moving the body. Get into the music. Read something you love. Make a cup of tea or a cup of coffee, something that takes quite a few steps for you to do. And in the fourth part of this 4-part series, that is these 12 to 15 episodes of this podcast, I'm absolutely going to be moving you through some specific practices. But I wanted to start with a few of them here. Okay. So we talked about stop trying to separate grief from mental health. We also talked about starting with curiosity if you're unsure what's happening. And this other one is about grief in other people. So if someone you love is grieving, check in without assumptions. So instead of saying, "Are you depressed?" try something like, "How you holding up? How are you feeling in this moment?" Instead of, "Let me know if you need anything." This is one I struggle with. Instead of saying, "Let me know if you need anything," say something like, "Can I sit with you in this? Can I just be with you for a few moments as you feel through this?" Basically, you're trying to be specific, not general. Because when you say, "Let me know if you need anything," it's like the big, vast ocean of possibilities and probabilities for the person who needs support. But if you offer something specific, it might bring in the vastness a little bit, and they might be able to say, "Yes, I want that," or "No, not that, but maybe this." So try to be specific with the ask of support. And then the fourth thing is to remember that you do not have to go through it alone. And that if you're wanting to support someone else, you don't have to do or be any specific thing. Being there and saying that you want to be there is a thing, a valid thing. So if grief is feeling like stuckness or isolation, right? If it has you feeling stuck, if it has you feeling consistently like you want to isolate, or unbearable, like you can't stand it, then you got to remember that you don't have to go through it alone. Reach out. A therapist, a support group, a trusted friend. Grief needs community. Grief needs community. Sometimes it's the community of one, meaning another aspect of yourself might be able to tend to that grief. Just like the example I gave where within my community of one, within all these things that comprise Aquila, if I am in a moment of grief being heavy, movement, dance, walking, trying to run for a little bit and then stop and then breathe and then listen to my breath. That is how I check in with my community of one to manage, to tend to my grief. The part of me that's sitting there and crying or frustrated spoke to the part of me that's like, get up and do something. And then we did something. But then there are other times where I need to go beyond my community of one. I need to reach out to my partner or my mama or my cousin or my spiritual companion or a coach that I'm working with or a really good friend who I know I can talk to about these sort of things. Grief needs community. So y'all, the point here is that grief and mental health are woven together. They talk to each other. They hang out. And the more we understand that, the better we can tend to ourselves and each other. So before we part ways, I want to leave you with a question. You know I love questions. What's one thing you felt in grief that surprised you? So while you were in the thick of grieving something or somebody one time, can you think about something that you felt in that grief that surprised you? Did it show up in your body, in your thoughts, in your relationships? I want you to sit with it as a part of this practice because grief ignored is grief that lingers. And the more the grief lingers, the more it will seek out other pathways, other means of survival that can move it into a mental health issue. So what we can do about that is to not ignore grief, by learning how to notice it and practicing how to be curious about it and tend to it. And let me pause here. Shout out to Kate, my co-producer on this podcast project, for bringing this to my attention. I am not saying that all mental health conditions are the result of untended grief. I want to make that clear. I am well aware, and probably you are too, that some people are living with clinical anxiety or clinical depression or other diagnoses, and that's not what I'm speaking to directly here. What I am speaking to are the times that our grief, especially because our grief tends to be silenced or ignored, starts to show up like what might be labeled as a mental health issue, and that's what I'm speaking to here. I am not saying that every mental health condition is rooted in grief. All right, I know that some experiences are lifelong, and of course some of them are connected to the impact of these systemic ills on our bodies, right? So I'm saying that for a lot of people, especially for folks who haven't had the space to really tend to grief, which is so many of us, that what might look or feel like a mental health struggle, like anxiety or depression, or other things that we are learning to rename as mental health or reclaim from calling it mental health, some of those could actually be grief trying to get our attention. That's really important to name, because sometimes underneath all the other things we deal with, what we are really carrying is grief that hasn't had a way to be expressed. I hope this nurtured your commitment, or perhaps merely your curiosity around becoming a more skilled grief tender. I will be here next week, where we will move into the second part of this 4-part series, where we'll be talking about personal grief work, managing and recognizing our own losses in more detail and with more support. Peace.
This episode is part of a multi-episode series that serves as a public, free grief literacy project called What I Let Die podcast. The show is co-produced by Akila S. Richards and Kate Umstatter Thompson. Show art by Chris Richards. Much of the content comes from or is inspired by Akila's Grief Tenders course called the Eyelid Course, an acronym for I Let It Die. Show notes and resources are available at radicalselfie.org/wild. Share the show with friends, and be sure to rate the show wherever you listen to it.
Audio by Raising Free People Network.